I think we're going to do one thing today in a bunch of different ways. And I'm not even sure exactly why it's important. I'm just sure that it's important. But before we get to it, we'll look back for a second. The problem of the play is somehow this. Oedipus is a king, a Tyrannus, who is successful and respected. He's a model of public spiritedness. They come to him expecting him to be able to solve the problems, the problem of this horrible plague, not because, not as a last hope, but because he did it once before, and he should be able to do it again, and because they trust him. On the other hand, he's someone who kills his father, marries his mother, and brings a terrible plague on his city. So he's on the one hand a Tyrannus king, on the other hand a Tyrannus tyrant. Plato tells us in the 9th book of the Republic that a tyrant is someone who does in reality what we all do in our dreams. And in fact, if you looked at line 980, you'd see that Jocasta anticipates what Plato will say a century later, not quite a century, by telling Oedipus, don't worry about having slept with your mother. Everybody wants to do that in their dreams. You're just doing in reality what all have done already in their dreams. So he's a tyrant in that way. So our question from last time is simple in a way. How are these two Oedipuses related? What does it mean that he's both of those things at once? Why is the good Oedipus singled out for parricide and incest? And if the chorus are correct at line 1193, when they talk about what he is, essentially they say, well, look, you in a way just represent what all human beings are. You are the paradigma, the paradigm, the exemplar of the human. So what does it mean that he does what everybody wants to do in their dreams, and in fact, that makes him the paradigm of humanity? Now, on the one hand, say Freud has an answer. We all want to do what Oedipus did, and Freud in his marvelous way meant all boys want to do what Oedipus did, which is to sleep with their mother. This is Freud as Jocasta, but in a way, what seems to be the end of the argument in Freud is in Sophocles only the beginning of the argument. It is the case that he's saying something like that, but he's really forcing us to ask what it is that parricide and incest mean to point to. They're emblematic of something. It's not anything quite so either sexy or dull, depending on how you look at it, as wanting to sleep with your mother. It points to something in a way much deeper than that. So we're not Oedipus, all of us, in any simple way, and therefore the question is obvious: in what way are we Oedipus? Or you could say, that's another way of asking the question, what exactly is it that Oedipus's public spiritedness has to do with his crime? Now, we did the opening speech last time. Today, we'll look at the rest of the prologue and then turn to the entrance of the chorus, the parados, and then do a bit of the first episode. So let's take a look at the text to find out what the one thing is that we're going to do today. So Oedipus opens with the speech we spent most of last time on, and then the priest responds lines 14 through 56. His response seems to have 5 parts. Who they are, these suppliants who have come to ask for help, that's lines 14 through 23. The plague, which is the problem that needs to be solved, that's lines 23 to 30. Why they think Oedipus can help, that's lines 31 through 39. Their prayer, lines 40 through 48. And what will happen to Oedipus if he fails, line 49 to 56. So let's look at the first part. I'll change the translation a little as I go. O ruler of my country, of my land, of my space, Oedipus, you see our company around the altar. You see our ages. Some of us like these who cannot yet fly far, and some of us heavy with age. These youths are the chosen among the young, and I the priest of Zeus. Within the marketplace sit others crowned with suppliant garlands at the double shrine of Pallas and the temple of Ismenus's prophetic order. Okay, so the group that's come to him is made up of old men, children, and youths. The priests are the old men. They are, impotent is perhaps too strong, but they're certainly not someone you would turn to as models of as models of sexuality. The children are human beings prior to puberty. The youths are unmarried men. So what's missing? I mean, apart from women who are obviously missing, that's important, but what else is missing? Well, I'm sorry? Yeah, and so you would say people like Oedipus, who is a father, right? So what you would think of as men in their prime. Now, that's interesting because that means there's only Oedipus to represent that group, but he, of course, is the man who doesn't fit. The man who's in his prime and walks with a staff. So the opening scene is meant to remind us of the riddle of the Sphinx, but it's actually a sort of skewed version of the riddle that it looks like it intentionally calls attention to what's missing here. Generation, or the possibility of generation. Insofar as man is presented here, it's neuter man, and there are no women. It calls, for that reason, you can see that it calls attention to the problem of Oedipus's solution to the riddle, however many years, 20 years ago. What walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs at noon, and 3 legs in the evening, there's something homogeneous about the standard that he uses for human beings, or that the Sphinx uses and he sees through. That is to say, you could say human beings are measured in terms of feet, as in a way the unit of measurement. But this homogeneity, the tendency to understand human beings as essentially the same and differing quantitatively only and not qualitatively, this tendency to understand human beings as essentially the same, however necessary and in a way appropriate it is for political life, ultimately, if you begin to think of it in terms of generation, what's absent here, leads to incest. It doesn't matter who the other is. The other is just another one. So no fundamental differences from the point of view of the family is deeply problematic. Hold on to that. Second part, beginning on line 23, not king, but you yourself have seen our city reeling like a wreck already. It looks as though the city, in a very common image, even down to our day, is being likened to a ship, the ship of state. You yourself have seen our city reeling like a wreck already, and then it can scarcely lift, change your translation, not its prow. That's a sort of nice poetic way of maintaining the image, but actually he doesn't talk about the prow, he talks about the head, kara. It can scarcely lift its head. So the subtle movement is from the image of the city as a ship to the image of the city as a swimmer. It can scarcely lift its head out of the depths, out of the bloody surf. A blight is on the fruitful plains of the earth, plants of the earth. A blight is on the cattle in the fields. A blight is on our women, that no children are born to them. A god that carries fire, it looks as though that's an image for fever. A deadly pestilence is on our city, strikes us and spares not, and the house of Cadmus is emptied of its people, while black Hades grows rich in groaning and in lamentation. So Oedipus ought to be puzzled by this report. He ought to be puzzled by the fact that later, sort of retroactively, he ought to be puzzled by the fact that murder is being punished by a plague that attacks generation. Notice also the burial issue here. Now, let's read the rest of it. Not we, but I and these children have not come as suppliants to this altar because we thought of you as equal to a god, but rather judging you the first of men in all the chances of this life, and when we mortals have to do with more than man. You came, and by your coming saved our city, freed us from tribute which we paid of old to the hard singer. This you did in virtue of no knowledge we could give you, in virtue of no teaching. It was a god that aided you, men say, and you are held with God's assistance to have saved our lives. Now, O head of Oedipus, most powerful to all, here falling at your feet, we all entreat you, find us some strength for rescue. Perhaps you'll hear a wise word from some god. Perhaps you'll learn something from a man. For I have seen that for the skilled of practice, the outcome of their counsels live the most. Noblest of mortals, go and raise up our city. Go and give heed. For now this land of ours calls you its savior, since you saved it once. So let us never speak about your reign as a time when first our feet were set secure on high, but later fell to ruin. Raise up our city, save it and raise it up. Once you have brought us luck with happy omen. Once you have brought us luck with happy omen, be no less now in fortune. If you will rule this land as now you rule it, better to rule it full of men than empty. For neither tower nor ship is anything when empty, and none live in it together. So you saved us once from a hard singer. And obviously they mean the Sphinx, but to call the Sphinx a singer looks as though there's a suggestion that there's some connection between the Sphinx and poetry. You did it once, you can do it again. They put him in a strange position. They came to his altar, essentially to pray. But they don't pray to him as a god, but rather they pray to him as the best of men. Now, how does he respond? We saw this last time when he says things like, your several sorrows each have single scope and touch but one of you. My soul groans for city and myself and you at once. He identifies himself with the city. He's, as we've seen, utterly public-spirited. He hurts for the whole, and so hurts more than any of the parts separately hurt. And it turns out that he has anticipated everything they ask him to do before they ask him to do it. So he's already sent to the oracle, and he ends up having sent to Tiresias before it's suggested to him that he do that. Now, this comes out especially in the exchange with Creon at 87 following. If you look at that, it's line 80, really line 84 through 90, we will know soon he's within hail, Lord Creon, son of Menetius, what is the word you bring us from the god? Change the translation. Good. For things hard to bear themselves, if in the final issue all is well, I count complete good fortune. What do you mean? What you have said so far leaves me uncertain whether to trust or fear. If you will hear my news before these others, I am ready to speak, or else to go within, speak to all. The grief I bear it more for these than for my own soul. So Creon says, do you want to do this in private or do you want to do it in public? Oedipus says, no distinction for me between the two. They're both the same, public and private. Creon's principle seems to be, at line 87, if the results in the end are good, then it's good. So the good is measured by its results. He's a sort of utilitarian. Later, he's going to remark that he would never plot against Oedipus because, as it is now, he gets all the gain without any of the bother of being held publicly responsible for what he does. So he gets all the goods because he thinks his situation is good because he gets all the goods. Now, it's important at this point that Oedipus literally doesn't understand what he's talking about. He says, what do you mean? What you have said so far leaves me uncertain whether to trust or fear. Now, this is connected to what he says on the following page at lines 103 through 5. My lord, before you piloted the state, we had a king called Laius. I know of him by hearsay. I have not yet seen him. So Oedipus identifies seeing with knowing. There is no distinction between the public, what's immediately manifest, what can be made immediately manifest, and the private. But of course, the interesting thing about what he says, I know of him by hearsay, I have not yet seen him, but of course he has seen him. He just doesn't know that he's seen him. He saw him when he killed him. So it turns out that he saw him and yet he did not know him, and therefore it can't be the case that Oedipus's understanding of what it means to know is correct. There is a distinction, you could say, between the surface and something deeper. But Oedipus, of course, doesn't see past the surface. Remember his inability to speak metaphorically. One other strange thing about this section, Oedipus says, what is the word you bring from the god? And you can understand why Green translates it a good word, because good sounds a little strange, but what Creon actually says is simply good. What is the word? Good. As though Oedipus had asked, what sort of word do you bring? Now, Oedipus, who is actually pretty smart, picks up on this, and thereafter he stays with this and always asks, what sort of thing? So at line 99, change your translation, not what is the right, but what sort of purification? How shall it be done? This provides a certain rationale for something we've already noticed. Remember, we saw last time that he made this strange move when Creon said, well, we know one thing. We know that he was attacked by robbers, and Oedipus goes on to say, well, the robber couldn't have done it without help from money from the city. He makes this move from robbers to robber. This is particularly strange since he announces at lines 120 to 25 that you have to follow up all leads, however slim they are, when you're doing an investigation, and then he proceeds to ignore the one lead that they have, which is that Laius was attacked by robbers, plural. I want to suggest this. Because Oedipus is inclined to collapse questions of who into questions of what sort, the difference between robbers and robber is in a way insignificant to him. He sees only the generic characteristic. He sees what in Greek would be called the eidos, the word that usually gets translated when it's in Plato as idea or form. He sees in a way the visible, comes from the verb to see, eidos. He sees the visible shape of things. Creon makes a point about robbers, and in a way, if we were to use Platonic language, Oedipus responds with a reflection on the nature of robber as such, or of robber, the generic being, not the particular being. And this, of course, when you think about it, turns out to be simply the intellectual version of his total public spiritedness, this tendency in a way to generalize. In both cases, this suggests that what Oedipus never takes into account is himself. He never does what Creon says the Thebans did. So if you look at line 128 following, you get this. Change some translations here. Oedipus says, not what trouble, but what sort of ill was so, in Greek, empedon, for you to know the murder of your Tyrannus, your tyrant. So what sort of ill was you could say, almost such an impediment? But empedon is really, etymologically, something that gets in your way because it's at your feet. In or at feet. So what sort of ill was such an impediment for you in finding out the murder of your king, or to know the murder of your king? Creon says, the riddling sphinx induced us to neglect mysterious crimes and rather seek solution of troubles at our feet. Now, Oedipus doesn't allow himself to be hindered, empedon, by what is at his feet, to pros posi, line 130. His feet, you could say, are swollen out of proportion to the feet of others. But Oedipus doesn't look at his feet. He doesn't see his Oedipus, his swell foot, himself. And therefore, he can say what he says at line 133. I think we looked at this last time, actually 135 following. And justly you will see in me an ally, a champion of my land, my earth, and the God. For when I drive pollution from the land, I will not serve a distant friend's advantage, but I, the defilement myself, will dispense. I myself, of myself, this defilement, this taint, will dispense. You could say what he never sees is the possibility that he himself could be the taint. I hope none of that makes sense yet. I mean, it's all sort of a lot of stuff. I think it begins to come together because parallel issues start to emerge in the entrance of the chorus, the paradox. By the way, this is line 150. After that, you have in italics, green gives you exeunt all but the chorus. That's just flat out wrong, because that leads you to believe that the chorus is the group of suppliants who have come to ask for help, and they aren't. The paradox marks the entrance of the chorus. You have, in effect, a new chorus, a new group entering. When Oedipus says, further up the page, wait a second, come children, take your suppliant bows up from the altars now, and you have called the assembly. It's really, let another call the people of Cadmus, and let it meet upon the understanding that I'll do everything. God will decide. The chorus called are the people of Cadmus, who are called as this is the 15 men who serve as the representatives of the people of Thebes. They're not the kids and the youths and the old priests that were previously supplicants. So that turns out to be rather crucial. So they're summoned by Oedipus. Who are they? 15 old men. The move from 12 to 15 in the chorus is the move that Aristotle in the Poetics tells you takes place in the move from Aeschylus to Sophocles. They're not the people, the laos, assembled, but the representatives of the people. Now, since this word laos can also apply to people in the theater, it's an interesting question whether it's meant here also to point to the audience, and obviously, if to the audience, then in a way as well to us. So what does the chorus know? They know that the oracle has been sent to, but they don't know Creon's report. That's why it's so crucial to see that Green has made a mistake. Otherwise, they would be in possession of knowledge of what Creon just said in public, but they don't know that. So the question, the sort of commonsensical question is, why are they made to give their first speech in ignorance of what the situation really is? They don't know why there's a plague in the city yet. Let's look at the first strophe. They start, I'm going to change translations again. Sweet spoken voice of Zeus, in what way do you come from the shrine of Pytho, rich in gold, that has come to glorious Thebes? I am stretched on the rack of doubt and terror and trembling. Hold my heart, O Delian healer, and I worship full of fears for what doom you will bring to pass, new or renewed in the revolving years. Speak to me, immortal voice, child of golden hope. So the chorus start by animating the oracle, the word, the voice of Zeus. Sweet spoken voice, that's what they're talking to and from which they're asking something. The first thing interesting is that you don't expect it, since they're talking about the oracle, you expect it should be voice of Apollo, but it's voice of Zeus. Isn't Apollo the god responsible? Zeus, as ultimate god, is in some way the source of all oracles. Is that the point? But then they switch to Apollo further down toward the end of the strophe when they say Odilian healer. And then they switch back to the immortal voice, Fama. The immortal voice, which is here called the child of golden hope. So there are some funny things here. There seems to be a conscious blurring of the distinction between Apollo and his voice, Apollo and his oracle. He's treated as though he's nothing but his voice. And that looks to be the reason behind the claim that the voice is the voice not of him, but of Zeus. In the end, the voice is called the child of golden hope. That's kind of peculiar, isn't it? Wouldn't you expect it to be the parent, the father, or the mother of golden hope? The chorus seemed to suggest that the oracle is the result and not the cause of hope. Let's do the antistrophe. We'll come back to all of this, I hope. First, I call on you, Athena, immortal, echoing the immortal in the previous, same word in the strophe. Athena, immortal daughter of Zeus, and Artemis, earth upholder, who sits in the midst of the marketplace in the throne which men call fame. And Phoebus, Apollo, the far shooter, three averters of fate, come to us now, if ever before, when ruin rushed upon the city, you drove destruction's flame away out of our hand. So there are two immediate connections to the first strophe. The first is Zeus, where you have voice of Zeus in the strophe and daughter of Zeus in the antistrophe. And all three gods in the antistrophe turn out to be children of Zeus. And second connection, in the strophe, you have immortal voice, and in the antistrophe, you have immortal daughter. So once again, by way of this parallel, you could say a god is likened to Zeus's voice. We don't know what that means, but it's certainly, it's in a way said explicitly and then said inexplicitly in order to confirm what we noticed the first time. In the strophe, the chorus call Apollo healer and pray to him to learn what will happen. Here they call on three gods, including him, in order to avert what will happen. Hold on to it. Second strophe. Now the first word, it's not, I mean, you can't be too critical of people. It's almost impossible to translate out of any language, and what's impossible in any language is 8 times less possible from Greek to any other language. But it should be, the Greek would be o popoi, which is a way of indicating, you know, that's a word It would be like alas in English. Oh, popoi, sorrows unnumbered. All the host is sick. Taking of thought is no spear for the driving away of the plague. The offspring of the glorious earth do not grow. There are no women bearing the pangs of childbirth. You may see them one with another like birds swift on the wing, quicker than fire unmastered, speeding away to the coast of the Western God. Western God is a way of referring to Hades. So it starts with o popoi. There's a tradition in Greek literature that we can only really trace back to the time of Plutarch, which is 1st century through 2nd century AD. So it's really, it's 500 years or at least before this, after this. Nevertheless, there is a tradition in Plutarch that popoi is dialect for theoi, and theoi is the plural of gods. So woes on the one hand, or alas on the one hand, is a way of naming gods. So you could say, if we follow Plutarch, addressing gods is in some way like addressing woes or troubles. Unnumbered sorrows here parallels the unnumbered deaths of which the city perishes in the second antistrophe. And metrically here, in the first antistrophe, metrically here, polis and popoi, polis, so we get here, which actually is the second antistrophe I'm talking about. So in the unnumbered deaths of its people, the city dies. So city there is polis. It's hard to tell, it's impossible to tell from your version, but it's actually in exactly the same position as popoi is in the previous stanza, in the strophe. And sorrows unnumbered are metrically in the same position with deaths unnumbered. So you could say, once again, the strophe is a description of a problem, and the antistrophe will be an appeal for help, for a solution. Let's look at the antistrophe entire. In the unnumbered deaths of its people, the city dies. Those children that are born lie dead on the naked earth, unpitied, spreading contagion of death, and gray-haired mothers and wives everywhere stand at the altar's edge, suppliant, moaning. The hymn to the healing God rings out, but with it the wailing voices are blended. From these our sufferings grant us, O golden daughter of Zeus, glad-faced deliverance. So we discover here that the dead remain unburied. Only the chorus notice this, and only the women are said to bewail the absence of burial rites. So the city perishes from a natural disease against which, as city, it's helpless. That's in a way a sign of what it means that the city so depends on the family, on generation. There's something happening, something natural happening, which threatens to destroy it by attacking generation, by attacking the family. Now, what does it mean that we're told here the lamenting, the wailing, and the hymn to the healing God are mixed together. They blend together. So the prayer to Apollo and the lamentation are in a way the same. Hold on to that. Let's look at the last strophic pair. There is no clash of brazen shields, but our fight is with Ares. Ares ringed with the cries of men, a savage god who burns us. Grant that he turn in racing course backwards out of our fatherland's bounds to the great palace of Amphitrite, or where the waves, or Amphitrite, or where the waves of the Thracian sea deny the stranger's safe anchorage. Whatsoever escapes the night, at the last light of day revisits, so smite Ares, Father Zeus, beneath your thunderbolts, for you are the Lord of the lightning that carries fire. Let's look at the antistrophe as well. And your unconquered arrow shafts, winged by the golden corded bow, Lycian king, I beg to be at our side for help. And the gleaming torches of Artemis, with which she scours the Lycian hills, and I call on the god with the turban of gold, Dionysus, who gave his name to this country of ours, the Bacchic god with the wind-flushed face, Evian one who travels with the Menid, the Menid company, combat the god that burns us with your torch of pine, for the god that is our enemy is a god unhonored among the gods. So we have another son of Zeus, Ares. Here they ask Zeus to smite him with fire, and they ask Zeus to turn against his own son, his teknon, his issue. The problem then that seems to be emerging is this. Without quite realizing it, the chorus appeal to the cause of their woes for the relief of their woes. That comes in a whole bunch of ways. Apollo in the first strophe is the voice. He's what predicts the plague. And in the first antistrophe is one of those who is appealed to for help. We've just been told that their prayer to Apollo combines lamentation on the one hand and prayer on the other. We've seen, if we follow Plutarch in this, that these two things that are metrically in the same position in strophe and antistrophe, popoi, we've seen popoi, and we know that it is sometimes used as a synonym for theoi. So we know that troubles or woes or ills are thought in a weird way to be identical with gods in the second strophe. We've seen in the last strophic pair the appeal to Zeus against Ares, and then by the time we get to the end of the antistrophe, the third antistrophe, the chorus call for out-and-out war among the gods. There's another element, though, to the problem. These gods are repeatedly represented as offspring, tekna, manifestations of Zeus. And so with the exceptions of the indirect reference to Hades as the god of the western sky in the second strophe, and the use of Amphitrite, the wife of Poseidon, but who is often taken as identical to the sea, all of the gods mentioned are offspring of Zeus. So if Zeus in some way lies behind all of the gods, then the real point seems to be that the very same thing is the cause of their woe and the cause and their hope for salvation. Now, of course, that reminds us a little bit of Oedipus, who, unknown to himself, is the very pollution that he's trying to get rid of in Thebes. So we've got there's something strange going on. We started with the sort of practical question, why is the chorus left in total ignorance of the content of the oracle? It looks as though the answer is this, because by leaving them in ignorance, it leaves this double nature of the gods much clearer than it otherwise would be. After the oracle, when they're told what they're supposed to do, the gods, as threat on the one hand and salvation on the other, have been sort of unified, and so the doubleness is harder to see. So this is going to come out in a different way in the sequel, in the first episode, in terms of Oedipus himself. But I told you earlier, I want to do one thing today, and I don't quite know what to do with it. But it does seem as though if you look back at all of the sort of details I gave you without any hint of what on earth they might possibly mean, there's a kind of parallel structure in all of them. And the parallel structure has to do with the fact that the source of their salvation and the source of their suffering these two things have been identified. There's something, and the prime example of that is in a way the gods. The gods, you could say, whom, I mean, if you want to put it in language that is not yet at least appropriate at all to this book, you could say, on the one hand, the god is the god they love, and on the other hand, the god is the god they fear. Or remember this word that I'm always, not always, but frequently, Denos. And I told you it's a strange word because on the one hand it means uncanny or terrifying. And on the other hand, the same word means canny. Canny has two ends, right? And, or clever. So it's a word which is frequently applied to the gods. And the interesting thing about it is that it looks as though it has this double meaning. And it looks as though, I mean, at first glance you could say, oh, what a strange thing about the language, that one word can mean two things so utterly different from one another. But in fact, what the passages we've been reading suggest is these things that look so utterly different from one another, uncanny and canny, look as though they're opposites. In fact, the claim seems to be that they're really intimately connected. They have to go together, and that in one way or another, this play is about that, pointing out what it means that they have to go together. You think about the way the Eumenides argue for the way they will cause Athens to suffer, it's by leaving. Because if they leave, then what draws the Athenians together will disappear, despite the fact that on the surface of it, they look like something terrible, guilt. And they make the argument that guilt is the bond. It makes possible the bond that holds a city together. Okay, let's look at his decree. Starts on line 216, divides in 6 parts. 216 to 224, an introduction, who he is. 225 to 232, the command to tell everybody with the result that the killer, whoever it is, will be banished from Thebes. 233 to 43, what's going to happen to them if they don't tell. 244 to 54, he places a curse on the killer. 255 to 68, why it's necessary to do this even without considering the gods. And finally, 269 to 75, the final threat, this time he makes it on his own authority. So if we look at the introduction, beginning at 216 following, Oedipus says this: "For what you ask me, if you will hear my words, and hearing welcome them, and fight the plague, you will find strength and lightening of your load. Hark to me. What I say out to you, I say as one that is a stranger to the logos, as stranger to the deed, as stranger to the deed. For I would not be far upon the track if I alone were tracing it without a clue. But now, since after all was finished, I became a townsman among you townsmen, now I proclaim to all the men of Thebes, all the Cadmeans." Okay, so notice that they pray to the gods in the Parados, but Oedipus comes in and answers them. So he seems to offer a human solution to a divine problem, even though the chorus had said at 169 that thinking wasn't going to help anything. It wasn't a spear that would penetrate this problem. That is, Oedipus offers his words as the substitute for the gods' voice, their fama, their words, their saying. Remember that these are this chorus has not heard the oracle. So he establishes his neutrality on the one hand by saying, look, I'm a stranger to both the story, the logos, and to the deed. And he uses this neutrality to argue for his suitability to rule on the other. He has now, because of his neutrality, become a townsman among townsmen. So we're told that he's three things. He's a stranger, line 220. He's a townsman, line 223. And of course, we know that he's a ruler who has taken on the aspect of a god. So what does he say? It comes as sort of a surprise, what he says to the Cadmeans. "Whoso among you knows the murderer by whose hand Laius, son of Labdacus, died, I command him to tell everything to me. Yes, though he fears himself to take the blame on his own head, for bitter punishment he shall have none, but leave this land unharmed. Or if he knows the murderer," the autokera, it's funny, it's a word that can mean a murderer, but also,
somebody who commits suicide.
yeah. So it doesn't, but here he doesn't mean that, right? Here he means someone who uses his own hand. But in other words, can you point out to me the one who actually did it? That's what it means here, but it actually means suicide as well. So interesting. One who kills himself. Or if he knows the murderer, another from another land, still let him speak the truth, for I will pay him and be grateful too. This is very mild stuff. He's more concerned with Thebes than he is with the health of Thebes than he is with punishing a murderer. So tell me who it is, and I'll exile the murderer, and listen, I'll pay you. I will bribe you. So the gods previously have used a stick, but Oedipus supplements it here with a carrot. 233 to 243, what I'll do to you if you remain silent. So he says, listen, if you remain silent, you will get the punishment I just promised the murderer. In somewhat more detail here as to its harshness. So the abetting of the murder or the aiding of the murderer is treated as though it's identical with the murder itself, and both are now identical with the pollution that has brought a plague to Thebes. So thinking, logos, and doing are not really different. This is typical Oedipus. This, however, is his addition. The oracle said nothing about this. Then we get his curse, 244 to 254. I'm going to read the whole thing, but I will read this bit where he says at 250, it's about 252, on you I lay my charge to fulfill all this, for me, for the God, and for this land of ours, destroyed and blighted by the God forsaken. For me, for the God, and for this earth. If the God is the God, of course, you don't need this speech. Oedipus, as an instrument of the God, should have no me of his own here. If you look at line 244, it's kind of interesting, your translation, it's really interesting to see what Green does repeatedly in order to take difficult passages and make them more palatable. So Green has, so I send forth a champion, I stand forth a champion of the God and of the man who died. But actually, the word in Greek is sumakos, which means a co-warrior, an ally. So I stand forth an ally of the God and of the man who died. He's in a way presenting himself as a co-determiner. He's on the par with his allies. He's not a champion in the sense of a lesser, a man lesser than the gods. So he ought to be a servant, and he's presenting himself as a co-author. Now, he presents himself as well, in a way, as a co-author of the oracle, since he has just replaced God's curse with his own curse. This becomes explicit, finally, at 255 to 68, where Oedipus says, it wouldn't really matter if there had been no oracle at all. It wouldn't matter if the divine, there had been no participation of the gods, of divinity. And finally, 269 to 75, he does this very strange thing. Those who do not obey me, may the gods grant no crops springing from the ground they plow, nor children to their women. May a fate like this, or one still worse than this, consume them. So he's in the midst of trying to solve a problem. They came to him, and what did they say? There is a curse on our land, there's a plague, and there are no crops and no children. Oedipus says, if you don't obey me, I will place my curse upon you, and there will be no crops, and there will be no children, which is just the current situation. So find Laius's killer or I will call down a plague against generation. He simply makes what he's learned from the oracle into a prescriptive decree. In this way, he tries to find some middle ground between being a citizen like everybody else, and so subject to the plague, and being, on the one hand, and on the other hand, being altogether a stranger who is like a god, and in some way a cause of the plague. So Oedipus, in fact, is the problematic togetherness of being the cause of the plague and subject to the plague. That's actually true of him. It's what's so weird about him. It has to do with the fact that that these things that he keeps saying as though they're metaphor aren't metaphor at all. So it turns out that he is, in the one hand, you could say in his role as king, they've come to him to solve a problem, and he tries to solve the problem. And it looks as though he stands above him, and they recognize that, and they think that he's been good at this sort of thing before, and so maybe he'll be good at it again. And so his plan is to find the stain, the miasma that exists in the city, and get rid of it. And when he says that, of course, he has no idea that he is the miasma, that he is, in a way, the problem and the solution to the problem. He's both the cause of the plague and subject to it on the one hand, and he's, on the other hand, their hope for a solution to it. Now, that's what we need to try to understand, what this means. What's interesting is that it's paralleling and mirroring exactly the problem that we saw coming up in various ways in the Parados, the doubleness of the divine. Zeus is, on the one hand, the cause of the plague, and he's, on the other hand, the being to whom we appeal to solve the problem of the plague. So it's not an accident, can't be an accident, that on the one hand, the divine is being represented this way, and directly after it, we watch Oedipus doing exactly the same thing. So that the underlying puzzle of the play, and you remember, in a way, Oedipus was, we saw last time that Oedipus, in a way, volunteered himself to be the symbol of the city. There's Oedipus who says, I suffer more than all of you because I suffer for all of you. So the question then would be this. One possibility. Are we being invited to ask the question whether the political life, whatever it is that makes political life, social life, life together possible, is it the case that we're to understand this as somehow the cause of our greatest ills, and at the same time, the solution to the problem of these ills? If Oedipus were to stand for the city, that looks to be the case. In a way, you could say, is this just another version of the doubleness of Tyrannus, of tyrant, which can mean king on the one hand and tyrant on the other? That's not an accident? I mean, I don't want to trivialize this because I'm not sure where it's going yet, but I think that at the very least you could say this. You can't have political life without the police. You cannot have laws that don't have enforcement. And as soon as you invest in a certain person or people the power to enforce the law, you have willy-nilly and necessarily also created the power to abuse the law. You can't have political life without force, and in a way you can't have the utter certainty of political life, of the goodness of political life, as long as you have force. It is why, by the way, in a strange, it looks at first very strange, Plato's Republic, a book that starts off in the second book after they do the preliminaries in book one, turns out to be a demand to show how perfect justice is possible. And then Socrates says, well, I can't do that without creating a city, so because that's where it would happen, so I have to create the best possible city, and then I will have shown you justice, the best. So that's what the rest of the Republic is all about. But by the time you get to book 5 and subsequent books, it's really not about the city any longer. It's about education. Why does a book that's supposed to be about politics end up being a book about education? That doesn't seem to make sense until you realize that if the fundamental political problem is the problem of the police, then the fundamental political problem is the problem of who's going to police the police. And it can't be a special prosecutor, because then you'd need to ask who's going to police the special prosecutor, and then you would end up with a special prosecutor and a special. So ultimately, it looks as though it would require something like self-policing. And self-policing would be the goal of education, if it works. Now, the Republic is not altogether optimistic about whether it would work, but the question is whether, the reason I paused before I said this is I don't think that this plumbs the depths of what is going on in this play, but it is a surface version of something that's going on in this play that has something to do with the fact that the problem and the solution are cut from almost identical cloth. And it's very, very hard to see how one gets around that problem. Wallace Stevens has a poem called The Connoisseur of Chaos, that, if I remember correctly, it's been a long time, begins with this phrase: a violent order is a disorder, pages of illustrations. That's the end of the first line. He's sort of tapping into, you could say, what you're suggesting is this, I think it's very much worth pursuing, that if the Furies are agents of fury and anger, are causes of disorder, even as though it looks as though it's tit for tat, but it goes on forever, it looks as though the question of the whole trilogy, and especially the last play, is to what extent is it possible to tame this fury and create, once having acknowledged the necessity of a certain kind of disorder, how can that be made orderly? Or can it be made orderly? And frankly, what I think you get from the whole trilogy is that that's what political life tries to do, with some success, but without complete success. The tension is always necessarily there. So far, it looks as though, as you put it, the Oedipus is coming sort of from the other side, where it looks as though the question is it the case that if you begin with a kind of perfect order, the perfectly public-spirited man, the man to whom everybody comes for the solution because they acknowledge that he's gotten, is it the case that even there you can watch that, you watch the disorder sort of necessarily seeping in? So the Eumenides, Erinnes, Fury's Eumenides problem in the Oresteia has something to do with the Tyrannus problem in this play, I think. But as you say, I mean, that's something well worth pursuing, something we should hold on to. It doesn't feel good enough yet. Feels as though there's more, that it cuts still deeper than that. We'll see. The question is, of course, in Greek tragedy, once you've seen this sort of generic problem, have you actually learned as much as you can learn? Or is it the case that if you push the particular, because plays, of course, are not, poetry is in general not, it's not something which is simply comparable to a philosophical treatise, right? So the particulars make a difference, and we've already seen that, given the way you've couched the distinction, that there's a difference between in the direction they're coming from. One coming from one direction, one coming from the other, and then the question would be, how does that change things? And why do you come from one direction rather than the other?